Hello, void and all who inhabit it. It's me, and I'm here to knock the dust off. Can I be honest with y'all for a second? There's a lot of satirical things I think would be better off just being called parodies or straight comedies. To me, there's something unsatisfying and honestly not very compelling about social commentary that boils down to,
"Isn't this behavior so absurd?"
Recently, there's been two really big waves of media that I think encompass this behavior pretty strongly. The first are those pieces that look to highlight the absurdity of rich folks by overemphasizing their behavior. And the second is the application of that same lens of absurdity to performative progressive behavior. This video is focusing on that first batch of media that looks at privileged people, namely because there's also been a recent wave of commentary pointing out the hollow feeling that comes from eat the rich films and television. I want to acknowledge early that this analysis is not an attempt to suggest that these pieces of media cannot still be entertaining. When it comes to mocking privileged people, I understand the appeal for viewers who feel like, finally, we're pointing out how ridiculous this behavior is. But while this method of humor can be a fun, silly, goofy time, I want to explore how it can also read like the satirical equivalent of empty calorie foods. The question of the hour is simple. Why do these pieces still feel shallow? The very obvious answer is that the hegemony will never financially back that which directly challenges it. Manage your expectations because all of this is still operating within a system, yada yada yada, boom boom ka. And to be fair, wealthy people will never genuinely criticize wealth, of course not. But they kind of need to, or at least pretend to, if that's the point of the story. There's an inherent clash in these narratives that should be addressed. Otherwise, it can feel like, why are you telling this story if you aren't willing to criticize bits of yourself that are also aligned with this big, horrible thing? I don't mean this in a
"you critique society yet you participate in it"
kind of way, but in a genuinely questioning the intent or purpose of a piece of media that is unable to engage past a certain point kind of way. While writing the script for this video, I was reminded of Falcon and the Winter Soldier and the idea of a piece of media making a statement that the narrative itself can't even stand behind. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, it stated that Carly, the main antagonist, simply can't be reasoned with. She's the type of person you stop, one could say. At one point, Bucky says that Carly is just as bad as Zemo or any other antagonist they've faced. But this sentiment is posited, if I remember correctly, an episode after Bucky doubles down on the need to work with Zemo. There's an active contradiction in comparing your antagonist to one of your collaborators as proof that she's irredeemable, while simultaneously being okay with that collaboration. My issue wasn't just that the contradiction existed, but that there's no effort within the story to grapple with it. Within the parameters of this conversation, I think a major contributing factor to the shallow feeling of eat the rich media is that these kinds of narratives don't try to acknowledge similar contradictions, nor be in conversation with them, especially if said acknowledgement might cause discomfort for the targeted audience. An example could be Claire DeBella in Glass Onion, who is this Democratic, arguably progressive candidate for Senate, who theoretically the target audience would align themselves with if she was a real person and someone we could vote for in real life. But she's getting money from Miles Braun, this ginormous douchebag. There's no effort in the story to amend the contradiction or address the contradiction of someone who presents themselves as being more progressively minded, being willing to take money from someone who is presented as, again, a giant douchebag who arguably isn't progressively minded, or at least is morally dubious in his willingness to give money to different people for different reasons. That all kind of boils down to his willingness to control these people for his own dubious needs, right? There's no time spent in the story to contend with the fact that Claire DeBella or Lionel Toussaint, who is the scientist, these people who are presented as like the more morally acceptable people, the smarter people, they're still taking money from this dickhead, right? What is that? What's the issue there? Let's talk about that. Let's do some research, mama. No, instead we're going to spend time making fun of Duke, but we're not going to actually deal with the itchiness, the uncomfortableness of who was actually willing to take money from this man and what that means in the grander scheme of things. Because again, one of the reasons, in my opinion, is that the target audience is supposed to see Claire and Lionel as people who we should be connecting with. and it's uncomfortable to consider the morally dubious things people who we might politically or ideologically align with would be willing to do to continue their own work. It's easier instead to pussy pop on conservatives and say, look how dumb y'all are, or on the misogynistic, or on the wealthy, because that is a population who A, is not targeted by this film as someone who's meant to enjoy it, and B, is an audience that the people who are meant to be watching this would feel okay laughing at, but they don't feel okay laughing at themselves or questioning themselves, right? These satirical critiques are meant to only be outward facing. It's not funny if I too am the bad guy, Chun-Li. But if self-reflection on the part of the wealthy person behind the camera, or the rich or middle-class liberal attuned enough to dabble in class commentary, is not part of the criticism, what then is this satire meant to do? In the 1970s, Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, used the term discourse to refer to the socially constructed system of meaning and knowledge made through communication. Additionally, he posited the idea that discourse can be challenged. Reverse discourses then reclaim, redefine, subvert, counter, shift, all of the above, that which is established via the discourse. Foucault applied the concept of reverse discourse when writing about sexuality, but this idea of shifting the power behind language, or recognizing that the power behind language is not static, has been used for decades. James E. Caron, a humor scholar, recently examined the use of reverse discourse in satirical political works in his book, Satire as the Comic Public Sphere. Caron makes an effort to separate comic satire from satire activist work, where satire activist work can create legitimate change, but satire as a whole is not inherently political. A part of Caron's analysis is that while satire can function as political comic speech, it is not supposed to be seen as something that is serious, that can cause actual changes to policy. However, even with that in mind, when examining satire as political comic speech, Caron does consider that ridicule can ethically operate in an effort to undermine and even reverse the direction of normative social power and institutional power. So reverse discourses can change the way we talk about things, the way we use terms and signifiers to create different meanings or connotations. Satire can then utilize reverse discourses to cause a shift in power, or as Caron puts it, to create ha-ha moments that are also aha moments. In my opinion, however, there is often only a focus on the ha-ha that leads to the audience either missing the underlying meaning or the creation of media that has less to say than it wants you to believe. At one point, Caron mentions that satire's inherent ethical risks become particularly problematic when satires package ridicule as parody, when their postmodern citation intends to rewrite, repurpose, and redirect racial and gender discrimination. He brings this up in relation to the works of two scholars, Jessica Finley and Lisa Guerrero, who examine pieces of media that play with Black stereotypes, but I want to highlight the potential ethical dilemma being heightened when satire is used to examine marginalization. We can lose the actual meaning of the satire because shit gets murky when your jokes are all about stereotypes and really sensitive material, which I think we as people consuming media are becoming more aware of when it comes to race and gender. But I'm wondering if that ethical concern is still top of mind when it comes to mocking the wealthy. Not to say that we shouldn't on rich people, but rather to ask, is there an inherently ethical risk in establishing a character too stupid and rich to realize she's outsourcing to a sweatshop, for example? Do we care, or are we just here to laugh? And is there a problem with that? Okay, so with all that in mind, the concept of a reverse discourse and satire's inherent ethical seesaw between critique and ridicule, I think the next aspect of unsatisfying Eat the Rich content is the aha factor that Karen identifies. When looking at these pieces of media, it's important to ask, what is the aha and who is it for? A perfect example of this is the moment in Glass Onion when Helen is breaking all of the glass figurines and everyone joins in late and leaves early. The scene of Helen smashing and continuing to smash even after the others dropped out of the chaos was perhaps mind-shattering to someone who needed to see the lack of solidarity inherent in liberalism in metaphor form. Very much milquetoast progressive recognition that Black women will save us. And to be fair, this metaphor of who would be the one to start the fight and keep it going is apt. What was icky to me, what made the aha fall flat, was the fact that there are no consequences for the chicken shit behavior of the other guests. They all join together to tell the truth at the end, while Miles is doomed to falling stocks in a house that is a pile of melted glass. But that's it. It kind of goes back to the first point of there's no acknowledgement of the contradiction in the behavior. In contrast, Knives Out did a much better job of criticizing behavior, even at the detriment to the viewer's comfort. One of my favorite bits of that film is Meg's arc. We're shown that even the seemingly lone, sympathetic member of the family is selfish when she tries to manipulate Marta and their friendship to her benefit. By the end, Meg is left in the driveway with the rest of her family. You do not get to stand on the balcony. You do not get to enter the house. You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir. As opposed to Meg's active betrayal, the friend group in Glass Onion is passive, to the point of apathy at times. But again, there's no consequence for their apathy when there should and could be. It's clear that Glass Onion's aha moment is for viewers who resonated more with the friend group than with Helen, especially in the discomfort of the glass figurine scene. I do think the film does a good job of forcing people to sit in being as uncomfortable as the others in the room who want her to stop. But by the end of the film, the friend group is assuaged of all discomfort and guilt. With Miles facing the brunt of the consequences, I'm left wondering, do you as a viewer leave the film considering your own complacent silence in moments when others need co-conspirators? Or do you simply feel bolstered by confirmation that the heinously wealthy did not reach their peak out of merit or intelligence, but by greed and cunning? And the thing is, two things can be true. You can be like, oh, billionaires really are bad, and reflect on your own position of privilege when it comes to wealth and socioeconomic class. But it is easier to walk away saying, I'm glad I'm not like Miles, than it is to consider all the ways you might be like Lionel or Claire or Kate Moss's character, who I don't remember the name of, who all did the bare minimum, because the film does the same. The onus is on Miles and, to a lesser extent, Duke. Eat the rich unless they seem harmless to you or are kind of aligned with you politically, and then you can let them loose after like 30 minutes of jokes. When the grounding message feels like a performative statement, the satire loses some of its bite. The main target of the satire are stand-in figures for people already perceived as pariahs by the intended audience. The intention to inspire a mindset shift is then a distant goal. We are simply making fun of people we don't like. But also, the statement of the film isn't really doing much more than, I see you, I hear you. Despite the behavior of the liberal middle class also being potentially harmful and worthy of critique, the characters that fit that don't really have to face any challenges beyond losing their billionaire benefactor. It's whack to point to just the very tip top of the pyramid as the root of all the issues. I'm digging into Glass Onion specifically in this section, but I think a lot of Eat the Rich films and shows can be asked the same. Are viewers pushed to reconsider the operation of a system, or are they simply reaffirmed in their distaste of others richer than them? I think we're at factor number 4 now, which is, I think that the flattened discussion of class also makes these pieces of media feel really unsatisfying. I don't really know where to put this, but I do want to take a moment to talk about Peg and Felicity from The Menu. These are both women who are put into the narrative as assistants to wealthier, more reckless people. And there is a shade of gray in how they exist. But the existence of this strict binary, as the menu puts it, the givers and the takers, excludes that shades of gray that Peg and Felicity exist within, that is probably more applicable to the average viewer, particularly people who might want to go see these types of films. Also, I want to be clear that I'm not bringing up Peg and Felicity to negate Helen and Margot and their roles in their own stories and how we are meant to access the narrative through them and their experiences, but rather to point out that these stories often operate in extremes. Either you are at the top or you are at the bottom. But I'm hesitant to say the truth. The reality, the potential reality, is that a lot of people who are going to watch these films are waffling somewhere in the middle. They are the Pegs, they are the Felicities, even if they didn't graduate from an Ivy League, even if they aren't working for an heinously rich person in hopes of utilizing that resource to start their own careers. They are not exceedingly wealthy, and they're probably not. I think Helen maybe is a little bit more connectable than Margot, but I say that mostly because Helen is better written than Margot and we get to see more of her. And again, my point is that a lot of people who are watching are somewhere in between. And my question is, how do these stories then address characters who also would fit in between? And the answer is they don't. They don't. The assistant, the middle person who is trying to operate between these two ends is really resonant, I think, with a lot of people. But instead, these characters, because of the flattening of class, get boiled down to a key trait to either make them sympathetic or be someone who can easily be tossed away. There's so much gray within how we examine class that gets lost when we focus on just insulting the rich. But the main thing about flattening class is the simplification of how stratification functions, which then impacts how one critiques it. So the flattening of who Peg and Felicity is an example of that. But again, we mostly get packed down to this strict binary of the givers and the takers, again, as the menu puts it. Often one product of this is the message of the system isn't the problem, the power is the problem, as exhibited in Triangle of Sadness, where Abigail ends up happier in the life of being stranded than she would be going back to actual society because she has power, right? And it's not the system of the society that was the issue. It's the fact that when you have power, you will do anything to keep that power. Beyond the fact that I do not believe cruelty is inherent to humanity, I think recreating a system without recognizing how it came to be helps support false equivalencies and a lack of understanding. Abigail became the leader of the people who survived because she's the only one with survival skills. The people at the top of our current social hierarchy are not there because they are the most capable. It is because they are the best thieves or descendants of the best thieves. It does not have to do with survival, but control. To equate the two is lazy at best, but there's also a huge missed opportunity to consider how the system we exist within corrupts our way of understanding humanity and each other because of an emphasis on value. When stories do start to consider that, it's often filtered through a perspective that places the more marginalized person as the near irredeemable antagonist, as we see in Triangle of Sadness with Abigail, or that spends more time with the privileged characters even if they aren't supposed to be sympathetic. For example, the message of the menu is, this is what happens to the artist when their work is cannibalized by the consumer, when the work is stripped of meaning and just meant for consumption. But Chef Slowick is not the only artist in that kitchen. Every one of those chefs is an artist as well, and he likewise is consuming their labor unethically, which is briefly examined in the 5th course. But because the focus of the film is on mocking the wealthy and punishing them for their behavior, the narrative places the impact on them above the impact on the kitchen staff. I think the menu does a really good job of having each guest be an archetype, but we know more about them and their emotional arcs than any member of the staff beyond Chef Slowick. We meet 2 sous chefs and a maitre d' that hollowly follow after him, but that's really it. The menu is a mean for the upper classes to articulate their fears, not for the lower classes to share their hopes. And yes, this goes back to the,
well, it's made by rich people, duh,
of it all. But even just looking narratively, we're positioned to care more about the rich people's stress, often in a way that sets up the lower class character as someone we should also fear. White Lotus, especially the first season, is a great example of the acknowledgement that there is a stratification, but the focus remaining on the wealthy vacation goers in a way that means the narrative skews to favoring their goals and concerns. There's a way to tell these stories from the viewpoint of the staff or the local or the poorer interloper looking out, but it's often the opposite. I think it's interesting that it's always negative facing, right? Like, even if we were to look from the bottom up, so to speak, it might also still be negative facing of like looking for death and destruction instead of considering like the ways people want to do better and be better. Sam Adler-Bell has a dope article in Vulture wherein they talk about the fantasy at the root of so many of these stories being a distribution of suffering. That, to me, is so inherent to the perspective of a privileged person, to believe that there can be no change without chaos, and that chaos is terrifying because of disruption that will be made to their status. That is in direct conflict with how so many of us are coming into these stories. We're expecting to follow the underdog, and for the privileged parties involved, even the managerial petite bourgeoisie adjacent character, so to speak, to be handled without causing more pain to the marginalized person. But the story is filtered through how the more privileged of us will be able to digest it. What really sticks out to me about Karen's analysis, specifically in the chapter that I'm citing throughout this video, is the definition of satire as it exists solely in the comic sphere as a form meant to change one's mind. Again, the goal is not to inspire policy level shift, but to push each viewer to leave feeling a bit different. It's, maybe an individualistic way to look at a mode of media that, to me at least, should have some macro level of commentary. Even if I don't think like a movie is going to lead to policy change, like I do think it should lead to like bigger picture thinking. All of this is to say, I don't disagree with Karen's definition entirely. I found his examination of satire operating either comically or politically and only occasionally as both, and what that means in regards to scope of impact, to be really illuminating. But I also think the inability of many satirical pieces to critique structural issues in favor of focusing on the individual can lead to our final reason as to why these examinations feel a bit shallow. To go further, the focus on the individual also applies to critique. Satire that looks to chip away at the system by insulting one figurehead or one idea of a person at a time. Consider, for example, how many Twitter accounts post-2016 built followings off of mocking Trump. How many of those same pages careened off the scene after Joe Biden was elected because they ran out of content? The system remains. There's still plenty to be critiqued. But the quote-unquote political satire during the Trump administration wasn't interested in change, but in insulting an individual. When we shift from tweets to entertainment, this gap between condemning an individual and critiquing a system continues. I don't think it's a mistake that the two most antagonistic characters in Glass Onion feel like allegories to real people. The characters who are closer to archetypes than exact figures have flatter stories and less criticism within the narrative, despite a depth of material available. Arguably, you could say the same of something like The Menu, where I think one of the most compelling stories that Chef Slowick had with the guest was the actor, who isn't even named, but who he saw like the same descent into hollow art as himself, as opposed to like the rich couple that comes there more times than they need to and never remembers any meal. Like, those people felt very distant and flat, as opposed to, again, the actor who is nameless but Chef Slowick has a connection to. A satire focused on changing individual minds continuously runs the risk of centering the problem on individual actions instead of picking at the system that allows said individuals to get to their point, which, again, to me, satire is meant to be looking at the system, even if by way of mocking individuals, which kind of also takes us back to triangle sadness of like, do you understand even why Abigail would be in a position to think that that's what she should do with power? Or is it just, it's Lord of the Flies, but with grown people that fell off a cruise? I did a review of Bad Hair a while ago, and in that video I kept asking, if this population is the target of your satire, and satire is ultimately meant to inspire change, what is the change you're hoping to encourage this population to make? I was asking that rhetorically then, but what change are you hoping to encourage is a question that I think all satirical work should be grappling with. It's easy, too easy, to simply pick out behavior you want to mock. Everybody want to pussy pop and show that they can intellectually dunk on conservatives, for example, but that is not enough. Moreover, this desire to dunk has led to this cardboard-flavored formula for how to be satirical. Pick a section of society, have their actions and mindsets replicated or parodied in a context that's meant to flip discourse to focus on them, but the conversation often isn't carried past the point of suggesting that it should happen, or worse yet, simply mocking a group of people. And instead of calling it parody, we say it's satire because it's provocative, or mocking a privileged class of people, or playing with stereotypes that we are uncomfortable with but highly aware of. I'm using the term political communication to just refer to communication with some semblance of political leaning. Karen discusses political communication as serious speech that's meant to do things like implement policy change. And while I agree that satire is no longer something that can do that, arguably was never something that could do that, satire also seemingly isn't capable of making boundary-pushing political statements. Eat the rich is no longer a radical cry, but a commercialized statement that can be recreated in media ad nauseum until we find the next semi-radical thing that has been pushed to the mainstream that can be churned out, chewed up, and commercialized once again. Ultimately, I think a lot of these Eat the Rich films and TV shows will leave viewers unsatisfied. If you're looking for deep class analysis, or even like 102 class analysis, like just a step above 101, because the point of these pieces of media isn't to have political communication, it's to have the aesthetic of political thought. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. Happy Pride, because I'm pretty sure this is coming out in June despite being recorded in May. How do you feel about Eat the Rich media? Again, I think a lot of these are still entertaining and interesting. The menu is probably the best of the three I use as examples, but I really enjoyed how Glass Onion kind of Miles Brawned the audience as well. It tricks you into believing what he's saying too, which I thought was cool. And I think the student loan joke in the menu, because I'm probably going to use it like 3 different times as B-roll, is fucking hilarious. Like, I love that joke. It was great. But again, the point of this wasn't to say these pieces of media are bad, but just like, if you're unsatisfied, why might that be? And it's not necessarily just because of having expectations that won't be met by media, but because the media isn't really set up to give you something to chew on past a certain point, Anyway. This was going to be a 2-part video where I looked at bodies, and they/them. But the more I whittled away at this, the more I started to rethink that. So we'll see. I don't know if I still want to do that. But I don't know. Now that the semester is gloriously over, I'm hoping to have some time to consume content again. This AMC Pass isn't using itself, girl. So hopefully that will get the brain churning and we'll get to see a few more videos before I inevitably fall into this descent of madness that is the academic calendar once again. Until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.